The old stagecoach rolled into Cedar Falls just as the October rain began to fall. Most folks had already gone inside for the evening, but those who remained on Main Street couldn't help but notice the lone passenger who stepped down onto the muddy road. She was dressed entirely in black. From her high-necked dress to her heavy veil that covered her face completely, not a single inch of color showed through. Even her gloves were black as midnight. The woman moved with purpose, her back straight and her steps careful as she avoided the deeper puddles. "Well, I'll be," whispered old Tom from the spot on the general store porch. He had been watching the street for 40 years, and he'd never seen anything quite like this mysterious figure. The woman walked directly to the First National Bank, her black boots clicking against the wooden sidewalk. Inside, banker William Peterson nearly dropped his pen when she entered. The oil lamps cast strange shadows through her veil, making it impossible to see her face clearly. "I need to complete a property purchase," she said, her voice soft but firm. She placed a leather bag on his desk with a heavy thud. "Cash payment for the Victorian house on Elm Street." Peterson's hands shook slightly as he counted the bills. It was more money than most people in Cedar Falls saw in a lifetime. The old Victorian had been empty for 3 years, ever since the previous owner died. Most folks thought it would never sell, especially not to a stranger who appeared out of nowhere. "May I have your name for the papers, ma'am?" Peterson asked, trying to peer through the thick veil. "Evangeline Morrison," she replied. "I'll be moving in tonight." The banker's eyebrows shot up. "Tonight? In this weather?" "Perhaps you'd prefer to stay at the boarding house until—" "Tonight," she repeated, more firmly this time. As word spread through the small town, curious faces began appearing at windows. The woman in black had purchased the old Victorian house with cash and planned to move in immediately. By the time she left the bank, at least a dozen people were trying to get a better look at her. Evangeline walked slowly down Elm Street, ignoring the stares from behind curtains. The Victorian house sat at the end of the road, surrounded by overgrown gardens and iron gates that had rusted with time. The previous owner had been an eccentric old man who collected strange artifacts from his travels. After his death, no one had wanted to buy the place. The house looked even more imposing in the rain. 3 stories tall with ornate woodwork and tall windows, it had been beautiful once. Now it looked forgotten and lonely, much like the woman who was about to make it her home. Evangeline pulled a key from her black purse. She had arranged the purchase through letters sent weeks ago, never revealing why she wanted this particular house in this particular town. The real estate agent had been happy to make the sale without asking too many questions. Inside, the house smelled of dust and old memories. Furniture covered in white sheets filled the rooms like ghosts from another time. Evangeline lit candle after candle, bringing warm light to the empty spaces. From outside, neighbors could see her silhouette moving from room to room, the flickering flames creating an almost otherworldly scene. "Look at that," whispered Betty Chun to her husband as they watched from their kitchen window next door. "Who moves into a house at night like that? And why won't she show her face?" Her husband peered over her shoulder. "Maybe she's hiding something. Scars, perhaps, or maybe she's in mourning." "Mourning or not, there's something strange about her," Betty replied. "Mark my words, that woman is going to bring trouble to our quiet town." As the night grew darker, more neighbors gathered to watch the mysterious happenings at the Victorian house. Through the tall windows, they could see Evangeline arranging furniture and unpacking boxes that had been delivered earlier that day. She worked alone, never removing her veil even in the privacy of her new home. Around midnight, the rain stopped, but Evangeline continued her work. She stepped out onto the back porch, and several neighbors caught glimpses of her standing perfectly still in the darkness. Some claimed they saw her talking to something in the shadows, though others insisted she was simply enjoying the cool night air. "She's talking to herself," old Tom told anyone who would listen the next morning. "I saw it with my own eyes. Standing out there in the dark, moving her lips like she was having a conversation with someone invisible." The story grew with each telling. By noon, half the town had heard that the woman in black was seen speaking to spirits in her backyard. By evening, The other half had heard she was casting spells under the moonlight. Evangeline seemed unaware of the gossip spreading through Cedar Falls. The next morning, she appeared briefly in her front garden, tending to the wild roses that had grown over the iron fence. Even in daylight, she remained completely covered in black, her veil never lifting to reveal her face. "Morning," called out Pastor Williams as he walked by on his daily rounds. He had decided to welcome the newcomer. Despite the strange stories he'd been hearing, Evangeline paused in her gardening and nodded politely, but she didn't speak. The pastor waited for a moment, hoping she might introduce herself properly, but she simply returned to her work among the roses. "Unfriendly sort?" he muttered to himself as he continued down the street. By the time he reached the church, the story had become, "She refused to speak to me at all, just stared at me through that veil like she could see right through my soul." At the general store, shopkeeper Helen Rodriguez noticed that Evangeline had left a shopping list on the counter, along with exact payment. The list was written in beautiful handwriting and included basic supplies: flour, sugar, coffee, lamp oil, and various herbs that Helen had to special order from the next town over. "Strange requests," Helen told her customers. "Some of these herbs aren't used for cooking. More like medicine, if you ask me. Makes you wonder what she's planning to do with them." The townspeople began to create their own explanations for everything Evangeline did. When she was seen walking alone at dawn, they said she was performing dark rituals. When packages arrived for her from distant cities, they whispered about mysterious ingredients for unknown purposes. When she worked in her garden late into the evening, they claimed she was growing dangerous plants. The truth was far simpler than any of their wild theories. Evangeline Morrison was a woman trying to start over in a place where no one knew her past. She wore black because she was still grieving a loss too painful to share. She kept to herself because she had learned not to trust others with her secrets. She worked at odd hours because sleep had become difficult since her world had fallen apart. But the people of Cedar Falls didn't know this. All they saw was a mysterious stranger who didn't fit their idea of how a proper woman should behave. And in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, a woman with secrets was either dangerous or fascinating. As her first week in Cedar Falls came to an end, Evangeline had successfully created a new life for herself. She had a home, supplies, and the privacy she desperately needed. What she didn't have was a single friend or even an acquaintance who might help her feel less alone. The woman in black had arrived in Cedar Falls looking for a fresh start. Instead, she had become the town's greatest mystery and biggest source of gossip. But sometimes, the most unexpected arrivals bring exactly what a place needs, even when no one realizes it at the time. 3 weeks had passed since Evangeline Morrison arrived in Cedar Falls, and the town had not settled into comfortable acceptance. Instead, the whispers had grown louder, and the stories more elaborate with each passing day. It started with small things that most people might have ignored. But in a town where excitement was rare, every unusual event became magnified into something much larger and more sinister. Old Mrs. Henderson had always been proud of her prize-winning roses. For 15 years, her garden had been the envy of every woman in Cedar Falls. The roses bloomed in perfect rows, their colors bright and their stems strong. She spent hours each day caring for them, watering and pruning with the dedication of someone who truly loved her work. But 3 days after she had loudly complained about that strange woman at the weekly ladies' tea, something terrible happened. Mrs. Henderson woke up to find every single rose bush in her garden completely withered. The flowers hung black and dead on their stems, as if some terrible force had drained all life from them overnight. "It's not natural," she told anyone who would listen. "Roses don't just die like that, not all at once. Someone did this to me, and I know exactly who." She pointed toward Elm Street, where the Victorian house sat behind its overgrown fence. "That woman heard me talking about her yesterday at the market. She looked right at me through that black veil of hers. I could feel her anger, even though I couldn't see her face." The story spread quickly through the town's network of gossips and concerned neighbors. Each person who retold it added their own details, making it sound more mysterious and frightening than before. At the same time, strange things began happening to Charlie Hendricks, the town drunk who spent most of his days wandering the streets, and most of his nights sleeping wherever he could find shelter. Charlie wasn't the most reliable witness, but his story was so unusual that people couldn't help but pay attention. "I seen her talking to them birds," he announced to a crowd gathered outside the saloon. Big black ravens sitting all around her in that garden of hers. She was speaking to them in some foreign language, moving her hands like she was giving them orders. People laughed at first, but Charlie insisted his story was true. "I ain't that drunk," he protested. "I know what I seen." Those birds were listening to her, nodding their heads like they understood every word. Then they all flew off together, heading toward different parts of town, like she was sending them out to spy on us. The very next day, several townspeople reported seeing unusual numbers of ravens around their homes and businesses. The birds seemed to be watching people, sitting quietly on fence posts and rooftops with their dark eyes fixed on the humans below. "It's like they're reporting back to her," whispered shopkeeper Helen Rodriguez. "I caught one looking right through my store window yesterday, like it was taking notes on my customers." But the incident that truly frightened the town happened to Pastor Williams' wife, Ruth. She was a kind woman who had never spoken ill of anyone in her 20 years of marriage to the town's spiritual leader. But she had strong opinions about proper behavior, especially for women. Ruth had decided it was her Christian duty to visit Evangeline and invite her to attend Sunday services. She walked to the Victorian house on a bright Thursday morning, carrying a fresh-baked apple pie as a welcome gift. Evangeline answered the door, still wearing her black veil, as always. Ruth could see nothing of her face, but she pressed forward with her mission. "Good morning," Ruth said cheerfully. "I'm Ruth Williams, the pastor's wife. I wanted to welcome you to our town and invite you to join us for worship this Sunday. The whole community would love to meet you properly." Evangeline stood silently for a long moment. Ruth couldn't tell if she was being considered or ignored. Finally, the woman in black spoke in her soft, measured voice. "Thank you for the invitation, but I prefer to worship privately." Ruth's smile faltered slightly. "Oh, but surely you understand the importance of community fellowship. We're all children of God here, and—" "Good day," Evangeline said firmly, and closed the door. Ruth stood on the porch for several minutes, shocked by what she saw as rudeness. She had never been dismissed so abruptly, especially when she was trying to do something kind and neighborly. 2 days later, Ruth collapsed during Saturday evening preparations for the next day's service. She developed a high fever that wouldn't break, and she spoke in confused, rambling sentences that made no sense to anyone, including her worried husband. "She's been cursed," declared Dr. Murphy after examining the patient. "I've never seen anything like this. Her body is perfectly healthy, but her mind seems to be trapped somewhere else entirely." The timing was too perfect to be coincidence, at least in the minds of the townspeople. Ruth had confronted the mysterious woman in black, and now she was suffering from an illness that defied medical explanation. "I told you all something wasn't right about that woman," Mrs. Henderson announced at the emergency prayer meeting. Pastor Williams called for his wife's recovery. "First my roses, then those ravens, and now poor Ruth. We need to do something before this gets worse." The fear that had been growing slowly in Cedar Falls suddenly exploded into panic. Parents began keeping their children inside after dark. People crossed themselves when they walked past Elm Street. The few brave souls who had considered introducing themselves to Evangeline changed their minds completely. Only one person in town remained skeptical of the growing hysteria surrounding the woman in black. Jacob Matthews lived on a ranch 5 miles outside of Cedar Falls, where he raised cattle and horses mostly by himself. He came to town once a week for supplies and heard all the stories, but they didn't make much sense to him. Jacob had seen plenty of strange things in his 42 years of life. He had witnessed droughts that killed crops overnight, storms that seemed to appear from nowhere, and animals that behaved in ways that defied explanation. But he had learned that most mysterious events had perfectly ordinary causes once you took the time to investigate them properly. Maybe the woman is just grieving, he suggested when Helen Rodriguez shared the latest rumors during his weekly supply run. Could be she lost her husband recently. That would explain the black clothes and why she doesn't want to socialize. Helen shook her head firmly. Grieving women don't curse their neighbors' gardens, Jacob, and they certainly don't make the pastors. Wife sick just for offering an invitation to church. You don't know that she did any of those things, Jacob replied. Could be Mrs. Henderson's roses caught some kind of plant disease. Could be Ruth Williams picked up a fever from someone visiting from out of town. Just because things happened after this new woman arrived doesn't mean she caused them. But Jacob's reasonable explanations fell on deaf ears. The people of Cedar Falls had decided that Evangeline Morrison was dangerous, and they weren't interested in hearing alternative theories. As the fourth week of Evangeline's residence began, the town had divided into two groups, those who wanted to drive her away immediately and those who thought they should wait to see what happened next. But everyone agreed on one thing: the mysterious woman in black was not a normal person, and her presence in their quiet town was changing everything. Jacob Matthews rode home that evening thinking about the scared faces he had seen in town. He had lived through enough real dangers in his life to recognize when people were creating problems that didn't actually exist. But he also knew that imaginary fears could become very real threats if enough people believed in them strongly enough, somewhere. In the back of his mind, he found himself curious about the woman who had caused such a stir without apparently doing anything more than moving to a new place and keeping to herself. Jacob had been alone for a long time since his wife died, and he understood what it felt like to want privacy while dealing with grief. Maybe, he thought, someone should try talking to her like a normal human being instead of treating her like some kind of supernatural threat. But that was a dangerous thought in a town that had already made up its mind about the widow in black. The storm hit Cedar Falls on a Tuesday night in late October, bringing with it the kind of wind and rain that made even the bravest people want to stay inside by their fireplaces. Lightning split the dark sky every few seconds, followed by thunder. That shook the windows of every house in town. Jacob Matthews was checking on his cattle when the worst of it began. He had moved the herd closer to the barn earlier that day, sensing the storm was going to be worse than usual. But even with his preparations, he worried about the animals' safety. That's when he heard his cattle making sounds of panic and fear. Through the driving rain, he could see something large and dark moving among his herd. At first, he thought it might be a wolf or mountain lion that had been driven down from the hills by the storm. But as lightning flashed again, he realized it was a horse. A riderless horse was running wild through his property, its eyes white with terror and its hooves dangerous to anything in its path. Jacob's cattle were scattering in all directions, trying to avoid the frightened animal that was crashing through their peaceful group. Jacob grabbed his rope and ran into the rain, trying to get close enough to catch the runaway horse. But every time lightning flashed and thunder roared, the animal would bolt in a new direction, making it impossible to predict where it would go next. "Easy there," Jacob called out, though his voice was lost in the storm. "Easy now." That's when he saw her. A figure in black was walking slowly across his property, moving directly toward the panicked horse, with no regard for her own safety. Even in the storm, even with rain soaking through her heavy dress, Evangeline Morrison moved with calm determination. Jacob watched in amazement as she approached the frightened animal. She didn't try to grab it or force it to stop. Instead, she stood perfectly still and began speaking in a low, steady voice that somehow carried over the noise of the storm. The horse's ears flicked forward. It stopped running and turned toward the woman in black, as if it recognized something familiar in her voice. Slowly, carefully, Evangeline extended one gloved hand toward the animal. "Come on, boy," Jacob heard her say as he got closer. "You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you." The horse took a tentative step toward her, then another. Within minutes, it was calm enough for her to take hold of its halter. The animal that had been terrorizing Jacob's cattle was now standing quietly beside the mysterious woman everyone in town feared. "That's your horse, I take it," Jacob called out as he approached them. Evangeline turned toward him, and even through the thick veil and the rain, he could sense her surprise at finding someone else out in the storm. She nodded once. "He broke free when the lightning started," she said. "I've been searching for him for over an hour." Jacob looked at the woman standing in front of him. Her black dress was soaked through, and she had to be freezing cold. But she had spent over an hour walking through a dangerous storm to find her. Horse, putting herself at risk without hesitation. "You can't go back out in this weather," Jacob said, having to raise his voice as another crack of thunder split the air. "My house is just over that hill." "You can wait there until the storm passes." Evangeline hesitated. "I don't want to impose." "You're not imposing," Jacob replied firmly. "You're accepting help from a neighbor, which is what sensible people do during storms like this." For a moment she stood perfectly still, and Jacob wondered if she was going to refuse his offer. Then another flash of lightning illuminated the sky, followed immediately by thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. "Thank you," she said quietly. Jacob led them to his barn first, where they got Evangeline's horse settled in a dry stall with fresh hay and water. The animal seemed grateful to be out of the storm, and Jacob noticed how gently the woman spoke to it, checking for any injuries from its wild run through the rain. "You're good with horses," he observed. "I've always found them easier to understand." "Than people," Evangeline replied, then seemed surprised that she had shared such a personal thought with a stranger. Jacob's house was small and simple, but it was warm and dry. He lit the oil lamps and stirred up the fire in the stone fireplace, creating a welcoming glow that pushed back the darkness of the storm outside. "Let me get you something dry to wear," he said, disappearing into his bedroom and returning with a clean shirt and a thick wool blanket. "The shirt belonged to my wife. She passed away 3 years ago." Evangeline accepted the clothes with quiet thanks and stepped behind a curtain Jacob had hung across one corner of the main room. When she emerged a few minutes later, Jacob got his first real look at the woman, who had terrorized his town with her presence. She had removed her veil along with her wet dress. Her hair was dark brown with threads of silver, pulled back in a simple style that had come loose during her time in the rain. Her face was beautiful, but marked by a sadness so deep that Jacob felt his heart tighten just looking at her. She was not a witch or a supernatural creature. She was simply a woman who had been carrying a heavy burden for far too long. "You're not what they say you are," Jacob said softly. Evangeline pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "And what do they say I am? Someone to be feared, someone dangerous." Jacob poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot that always sat warming by his fire. "But you're just someone who's been hurt." For the first time since arriving in Cedar Falls, Evangeline felt tears threatening to fall. This stranger had looked at her and seen not a mystery to be solved or a threat to be eliminated, but simply a human being who was struggling with pain. "I lost my husband last year," she said, accepting the warm cup with hands that trembled slightly. "He died of consumption, and there was nothing I could do to save him, nothing at all." Jacob settled into the chair across from her. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside his small house, 2 lonely people were finding an unexpected connection. "I'm sorry," he said, and the simple words carried more comfort than all the elaborate sympathy speeches she had endured from well-meaning acquaintances back home. "I was a nurse during the war," Evangeline continued, as if the words had been trapped inside her for months and were finally finding their way out. "I saved so many lives, helped so many people recover from terrible injuries. But when it came to my own husband, all my knowledge and experience meant nothing." "That's not your fault," Jacob said gently. "Isn't it?" Evangeline's voice was barely above a whisper. "I should have recognized the symptoms sooner. I should have found better. Doctors tried different treatments. I should have done something." Jacob recognized the tone in her voice because he had heard it in his own thoughts many times over the past 3 years. "When my wife died, I spent months thinking about all the things I should have done differently. Should have taken her to the big city doctors sooner. Should have insisted on more tests. Should have been a better husband, so she would have had more reasons to fight the illness. Evangeline looked up at him with eyes that showed she understood exactly what he meant. But eventually, Jacob continued, I realized that torturing myself with should-haves wasn't bringing her back. It was just making it impossible for me to live the life she would have wanted me to have. They talked through the night as the storm gradually lost its strength outside. Jacob learned that Evangeline had moved to Cedar Falls because she needed to escape the places that reminded her of her failure to save her husband. She had chosen their small town specifically because it was far from anyone who knew her story. Evangeline learned that Jacob had been living alone on his ranch since his wife's death, finding it easier to deal with cattle and horses than with people who wanted to help him move on according to their own timeline. The folks in town think you're some kind of supernatural threat, Jacob told her as dawn began to break through the clouds. Evangeline smiled sadly. Maybe it's easier for them to believe I'm dangerous than to accept that I'm just someone who prefers to grieve privately. They'll come around eventually, Jacob said, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it himself. Will they? Evangeline asked. Or will they just find new reasons to fear what they don't understand? As the sun rose over Cedar Falls, two people who had been living with loneliness and pain discovered that sometimes the most unexpected encounters can offer exactly what both hearts need. Jacob had found someone who understood grief without trying to fix it. Evangeline had found someone who looked at her and saw a person rather than a mystery, but in a small town where gossip traveled faster than wildfire, their growing friendship would soon become another source of scandal and concern. The woman in black had found an ally, but that alliance would test both of their strength in ways neither of them could have predicted. After that stormy night, something had changed between Jacob Matthews and Evangeline Morrison, though neither of them spoke about it openly. Jacob found himself thinking about the sad woman with kind eyes who had shared coffee with him by the fireplace. Evangeline discovered that for the first time in over a year, she looked forward to something, the possibility that she might not have to face her grief entirely alone. It started with small gestures that both of them pretended were completely ordinary. Jacob began leaving fresh vegetables from his garden on Evangeline's back porch. He told himself he was simply being a good neighbor, sharing his surplus crops the way country people had always done. But the truth was that he carefully selected the best tomatoes, the sweetest corn, and the most tender beans because he wanted to bring some small pleasure to someone who seemed to have very little joy in her life. Evangeline would find the vegetables early in the morning, when she stepped outside to tend her own garden. She never saw Jacob making these deliveries, but she recognized the care that went into choosing each item. In return, she began leaving small gifts of her own, fresh bread wrapped in clean cloth, jars of honey from the beehives she had discovered in the overgrown section of her property, and hand-sewn items like pot holders and dish towels. For several weeks, they maintained this silent exchange without ever acknowledging what they were doing. Jacob would drive his wagon past her house, on his way to and from town, always slowing down slightly to see if she was working in her garden. Evangeline would time her outdoor chores to coincide with his usual travel schedule, finding comfort in the friendly wave he offered whenever he spotted her among the flowers. But in a town the size of Cedar Falls, very little could happen without someone noticing and talking about it. I seen Jacob Matthews stopping by that woman's place again yesterday, old Tom announced to the group of men gathered outside the general store. That's the third time this week his wagon's been parked outside her gate. Sheriff Bobby Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. He had known Jacob for over 15 years and considered him one of the most sensible men in the county. Maybe he's just checking on her, making sure she's settling in all right. That's what neighbors do. Normal neighbors, sure, replied Mr. Thompson, who ran the hardware store. But we're talking about the witch woman here. No good can come from Jacob getting mixed up with her. The men nodded in agreement, their concern for Jacob mixing with their growing fear of what Evangeline might do to him. In their minds, she had already cursed Mrs. Henderson's roses and made the pastor's wife sick. What might she do to a man who spent time alone with her? The women of Cedar Falls were equally worried, though their concerns took a different form. They had been trying for 3 years to find Jacob a suitable new wife, organizing dinner invitations and social gatherings, designed to introduce him to eligible ladies from their town and neighboring communities. "It's such a shame," sighed Mrs. Chun to the other ladies at their weekly sewing circle. "Jacob is a good man who deserves happiness. But instead of choosing one of the nice women we've introduced him to, he's becoming fascinated with that strange creature who won't even show her face in public. Someone needs to talk sense into him," declared Mrs. Henderson, whose rose garden was finally beginning to recover from its mysterious blight, "before he does something foolish that he'll regret for the rest of his life." The ladies decided to take action. Over the next 2 weeks, they organized a series of social events specifically designed to distract Jacob from his growing interest in Evangeline. There was a barn dance where they made sure he was partnered with the prettiest single women in the county. There was a church picnic where they seated him next to the most accomplished cooks and the most charming conversationalists they could find. Jacob attended these events politely, but his heart wasn't in the festivities. The women they introduced him to were perfectly nice, but they seemed to exist in a different world from the one where he had sat by a fireplace listening to someone speak honestly about grief and loss. Their cheerful chatter about weather and local gossip felt shallow compared to the deeper conversations he longed to have. Meanwhile, Evangeline was struggling with emotions she hadn't expected to feel again. The simple kindness Jacob showed her through his gifts of vegetables and friendly waves had awakened something she thought had died with her husband. She found herself looking forward to his weekly trips to town, timing her garden work so she could see him pass by her house, but she also felt guilty for enjoying these small moments of connection. Her husband had been dead for less than 2 years. Was it wrong to feel grateful for another man's attention? Was she betraying the memory of the love she had lost? These internal conflicts made her even more withdrawn from the rest of the community. She spoke to no one except the shopkeepers who filled her supply orders, and even those conversations were limited to the basics of commerce. People who tried to greet her on the street received only a polite nod before she hurried away. "She's getting stranger every day," reported Helen Rodriguez after Evangeline's latest visit to the general store. "Won't make eye contact, won't engage in normal conversation. Just hands over her list and her money like she's afraid of human contact." What Helen didn't understand was that Evangeline was afraid, not of human contact itself, but of the questions and judgments that would follow if people knew she was developing feelings for Jacob Matthews. She had seen how quickly rumors spread in Cedar Falls, and she didn't want to cause problems for the one person who had shown her genuine kindness. The situation became more complicated when Dr. Murphy made an observation that sent new waves of concern through the community. "I've been watching that Matthews fellow," he told Sheriff Rodriguez during their weekly card game. "There's something different about him lately. He's distracted, preoccupied. Doesn't seem like himself at all." "Different? How?" the sheriff asked, though he was beginning to suspect he knew the answer. "Like a man who's got something on his mind that he can't stop thinking about," Dr. Murphy replied. "Something that's making him neglect his usual responsibilities and relationships. I've seen it before, and it usually means trouble." "Sheriff." Rodriguez knew he had to take action before the situation got out of hand. As the elected lawman of Cedar Falls, he felt responsible for protecting all of his citizens, including Jacob Matthews, from potential harm. He rode out to Jacob's ranch the following Saturday morning, arriving just as Jacob was finishing his morning chores. The two men had been friends for years, and the sheriff hoped a direct conversation would help him understand what was really happening. "Morning, Jacob," he called out as he dismounted from his horse. "Thought I'd stop by and see how you're doing." Jacob looked up from the fence he was repairing and smiled. "Bobby, good to see you. Coffee's still warm if you want some." As they sat on Jacob's front porch drinking coffee and watching the cattle graze in the distance, Sheriff Rodriguez tried to find the right words to express his concerns without offending his friend. "Jacob," he began carefully, "I've been hearing some talk in town about you and the new woman on Elm Street." Jacob's expression didn't change, but the sheriff noticed his grip tighten slightly on his coffee cup. What kind of talk? People are worried about you. They think maybe she's influencing you somehow, making you act different than usual. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, considering his response. He could deny everything, claim that his relationship with Evangeline was purely neighborly, or he could tell the truth and risk confirming the town's worst fears. She's not what people think she is, Bobby, he said finally. She's just a woman who's been through some hard times and needs a friend. Maybe so, the sheriff replied. But perception matters in a place like this. And right now, people are perceiving that you're getting involved with someone who might be dangerous. Dangerous how? Jacob asked, his voice carrying a hint of irritation. Because she dresses in black and keeps to herself? Because she doesn't attend church services or social gatherings? When did privacy become a crime in Cedar Falls? Sheriff Rodriguez held up his hands in a peaceful gesture. I'm not saying she's done anything wrong. I'm just saying that your association with her is causing concern among people who care about you. Jacob stood up and walked to the edge of his porch, looking out over the land he had worked so hard to build into a successful ranch. And what would you have me do, Bobby? Ignore a neighbor who might need help? Turn my back on someone just because other people don't approve of her? I'm asking you to be careful, the sheriff replied. Make sure you're thinking clearly about whatever relationship you're developing with her. Don't let loneliness cloud your judgment. After Sheriff Rodriguez left, Jacob sat alone on his porch thinking about the warning he had received. He understood that his friend was trying to protect him, but the conversation had made one thing very clear. The people of Cedar Falls had already decided that Evangeline Morrison was dangerous, and they weren't interested in evidence to the contrary. For the first time since meeting Evangeline, Jacob realized that their growing friendship might have consequences he hadn't considered. But as he thought about the woman who had risked her safety to find her, the November morning started like any other in Cedar Falls, with children walking to school and adults beginning their daily work. But by noon, everything had changed because of what happened at Miller's Creek behind Evangeline's house. 8-year-old Tommy Peterson, the banker's youngest son, had been playing with his friends near the creek when he decided to show off by walking across a fallen log that bridged the water. The recent rains had made the log slippery, and the creek was running higher and faster than usual. Tommy slipped. He fell into the rushing water with a splash that his friends heard from 20 yards away. The current immediately swept him downstream, toward a section where the creek deepened and narrowed between rocky banks. Tommy couldn't swim well, and the cold water made it even harder for him to stay afloat. His friends ran alongside the creek, screaming for help, but there were no adults in sight. The schoolhouse was too far away, and most of the men were working at businesses on the other side of town. Tommy's head disappeared under the water for several seconds before he managed to surface again, gasping and flailing desperately. That's when Evangeline appeared. She had been working in her back garden when she heard the children screaming. Without hesitation, she dropped her gardening tools and ran toward the creek. When she saw Tommy struggling in the water, she didn't stop to remove her heavy black dress or consider her own safety. Evangeline plunged into the creek. The water was shockingly cold and moved faster than she had expected, but she was a strong swimmer. More importantly, she had experience dealing with emergencies under difficult conditions. During the war, she had pulled wounded soldiers from rivers and marshes, always staying calm while others panicked around her. She reached Tommy just as he was going under for the third time. Wrapping one arm around his chest, she used her other arm and her legs to fight against the current, gradually working her way toward the bank where the frightened children were gathered. "Hold on, Tommy," she said steadily as they struggled through the water together. "I've got you. You're going to be fine." By the time they reached the creek bank, Tommy was unconscious and blue from the cold. Evangeline pulled him onto the muddy ground and immediately began checking his breathing and pulse. Using skills she had learned during her years as a nurse, the boy wasn't breathing without missing a beat. Evangeline tilted Tommy's head back, cleared his airway, and began the rescue breathing techniques that had saved lives during the war. She pressed on his chest in a steady rhythm, forcing water from his lungs and trying to restart his breathing. "Come on," she whispered. "Come on, Tommy. Breathe for me." The children watching from a few feet away had never seen anything like it. This mysterious woman they had been taught to fear was fighting to save their friend's life with a skill and determination that seemed almost magical. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Tommy suddenly coughed up creek water and began breathing on his own. His eyes fluttered open, and he looked up at Evangeline with confusion and gratitude. "You're safe now," she told him gently, wrapping him in her own shawl to keep him warm. "Everything's going to be all right." Word of the rescue spread through Cedar Falls faster than wildfire. By evening, everyone in town had heard some version of the story about how the mysterious woman in black had saved Tommy Peterson's life, but instead of gratitude, the incident created even more fear and suspicion among the townspeople. "It's too convenient," declared Mrs. Henderson at an emergency meeting called by several concerned citizens. "That boy just happens to fall into the creek right behind her house, and she just happens to be there at exactly the right moment. I don't believe in coincidences like that." Others nodded in agreement. "She probably caused the accident in the first place," suggested Mr. Thompson. "Maybe she was planning to rescue him so people would think she was a hero instead of a threat." Dr. Murphy, who had examined Tommy after the incident, tried to inject some reason into the discussion. "The boy would have died if she hadn't acted quickly. Whatever you think about this woman, she saved a child's life today." "Did she save him, or did she just undo whatever spell she had cast on him?" Mrs. Chun asked. "How do we know she didn't make him fall into that creek using her dark powers?" The fear and suspicion that had been building for weeks finally erupted into open anger. A group of men, led by Mrs. Henderson's husband and several other prominent citizens, decided it was time to take action. "We can't let this continue," declared Mr. Henderson. "First my wife's roses, then the pastor's wife getting sick, and now this business with the creek. She's playing games with us, and it has to stop." They marched to Evangeline's house that evening, carrying torches and demanding that she come outside to face their questions. The crowd grew as more people joined them, until nearly half the town was gathered outside the Victorian house on Elm Street. "Come out here," Mr. Henderson shouted. "We know what you are, and we want you gone." Inside the house, Evangeline stood at her front window watching the angry faces illuminated by torchlight. She had faced mobs before, during the war and in the difficult months after her husband's death. She knew that fear could make ordinary people dangerous when they felt threatened by something they didn't understand. That's when Jacob Matthews arrived. He had been in town buying supplies when he heard about the crowd gathering at Evangeline's house. Without thinking about the consequences, he rode his horse directly through the group of protesters and dismounted at her front gate. "What's going on here?" he demanded, facing the crowd with his back to Evangeline's front door. "Jacob, get away." From there, called out Sheriff Rodriguez, who had arrived just behind him. "This isn't your concern?" "A mob threatening one of my neighbors is absolutely my concern," Jacob replied firmly. "Especially when that neighbor saved a child's life." "Today," Mr. Henderson stepped forward, his face red with anger. "She didn't save anyone, Jacob. She caused this whole thing to make herself look good. Can't you see that?" "What I see," Jacob said, his voice carrying clearly over the crowd, "is a group of people who are so afraid of someone different that they'd rather believe in supernatural explanations than accept a simple act of kindness." The crowd murmured angrily, but Jacob continued speaking before anyone could interrupt him. "You want to know the truth about Evangeline Morrison? She's a trained nurse who served during the war. She's a widow who lost her husband to consumption and came here to start over in a place where nobody knew her story. She wears black because she's in mourning, not because she's practicing witchcraft." "How do you know all that?" demanded Mrs. Chun. "How long have you been talking to her?" Jacob took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would change everything for both him and Evangeline. "Long enough to know that she's a good person who deserves better treatment than this." The crowd erupted in angry shouts and accusations. People who had known Jacob for years suddenly looked at him with suspicion and disappointment. He had confirmed their worst fears about his relationship with the woman they considered dangerous. "Jacob, you don't know what you're saying," pleaded Pastor Williams, who had arrived with his wife Ruth. She had recovered from her mysterious illness, but still looked pale and shaken. "That woman has some kind of power over you. You're not thinking clearly." "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in 3 years," Jacob replied. "Clear enough to recognize the difference between facts." Sheriff Rodriguez stepped between Jacob and the crowd, sensing that the situation was about to turn violent. "Everyone needs to calm down and go home. We're not solving anything by standing here shouting at each other." But the damage had been done. Jacob's public defense of Evangeline had divided the town into 2 camps: those who trusted his judgment and were willing to reconsider their opinion of the mysterious woman, and those who believed he had fallen under some kind of supernatural influence. As the crowd gradually dispersed, Jacob remained standing outside Evangeline's gate. She opened her front door and stepped onto the porch, still wearing the damp clothes from her rescue of Tommy Peterson. "You shouldn't have done that," she said quietly. "Now they'll turn against you too." Jacob looked at the woman who had risked her life to save a child and then faced an angry mob with dignity and courage. Maybe it's time someone in this town stood up for what's right instead of what's popular. But even as he spoke those brave words, Jacob knew that his public support of Evangeline had started something that neither of them could control. The people of Cedar Falls had made their choice about the woman in black, and now they would have to make a choice about him as well. The morning after Jacob's public defense of Evangeline, Cedar Falls felt like a town divided by an invisible line. People who had been friends and neighbors for decades now looked at each other with suspicion and uncertainty, unsure which side of the conflict each person supported. Jacob discovered the cost of his decision almost immediately. When he arrived at his ranch that morning, he found 3 of his hired hands waiting by the barn with their belongings packed. These men had worked for him for over 2 years, helping him build his cattle operation into one of the most successful in the county. "We're sorry, Mr. Matthews," said Will Patterson, the oldest of the 3. "We respect you, and we've enjoyed working here, but we can't stay on with a man who's gotten himself mixed up with with what everyone's saying you've gotten mixed up with." Jacob felt a heaviness settle in his chest. "And what exactly is everyone saying I've gotten mixed up with?" "Dark forces," replied Tommy Walsh, a young man whose family had been among the first settlers in Cedar Falls. "Witchcraft, unnatural influences, things that could bring bad luck to anyone associated with them." The third man, Pete Rodriguez, shifted uncomfortably. He was the sheriff's younger brother and had always been more reasonable than most. "It's not that we believe all the stories, Mr. Matthews, but our families are worried. Our wives don't want us working for someone who might not be thinking clearly about certain situations." Jacob knew there was no point in arguing with them. Fear was a powerful motivator, and these men had families to consider. "I understand," he said simply. "You'll find your final pay in the barn office." After the men left, Jacob stood alone in his ranch yard looking at all the work that needed to be done. Fall was the busiest time of year, with cattle to be moved to winter pastures and preparations to be made for the cold months ahead. Losing 3 experienced workers would make everything much more difficult, but that was only the beginning. Over the next few days, Jacob discovered that his public support of Evangeline had consequences that reached into every aspect of his life. In Cedar Falls, when he went to the general store for supplies, Helen Rodriguez was polite but cool, completing his order without the friendly conversation they had always shared. "Helen," Jacob said as she tallied his purchases, "is there a problem?" She looked up at him with eyes that held disappointment rather than anger. "Jacob, you've been a good customer for many years, but I have to think about my other customers too. Some of them are uncomfortable shopping in a store that serves people who associate with that woman. So you're asking me to choose between buying supplies here and maintaining a friendship with my neighbor?" Helen sighed deeply. "I'm not asking you to choose anything, Jacob. I'm just explaining why things might be different from now on." The pattern repeated itself throughout town. The blacksmith, who had always done quick repairs on Jacob's equipment, suddenly had a 2-week backlog of work whenever Jacob needed something fixed. The feed store owner began requiring cash payment instead of extending the credit arrangements they had maintained for years. Even the barber found reasons to be too busy to cut Jacob's hair during his usual appointment times. Most painful of all was the reaction from people Jacob had considered real friends. Pastor Williams stopped by the ranch on a Thursday afternoon, driving his wagon slowly up the dirt road as if he was reluctant to make the visit. Jacob had known the pastor for over 15 years, and they had supported each other through the difficult times after both of their wives became ill. "Jacob," Pastor Williams said as they sat on the front porch, "I've come to ask you to reconsider the path you're on." "And what path is that, Pastor?" "The path that leads away from this community and toward influences that might not have your best interests at heart." Jacob had been expecting this conversation, but it still hurt to hear it from someone he respected. "You think Evangeline Morrison is some kind of evil influence?" "I think she's a woman with secrets who has brought nothing but trouble to our town since the day she arrived," Pastor Williams replied. "And I think your judgment may be compromised by feelings that aren't entirely appropriate." The conversation that followed was painful for both men. Pastor Williams genuinely cared about Jacob and was concerned for his spiritual and emotional well-being. Jacob appreciated the pastor's concern but couldn't accept his assessment of Evangeline based on fear and gossip rather than facts. "I've seen her character," Jacob said finally. "I've talked with her, listened to her story, watched how she treats people and animals. Everything I've observed tells me she's a good person who's been through difficult times. And I've seen what's happened to this town since she arrived," Pastor Williams replied. "Ruth's mysterious illness, Mrs. Henderson's garden, that business with the creek. Too many strange things for it to be coincidence." They parted that day without resolution, and Jacob knew he had lost another relationship that had meant a great deal to him, but the most devastating blow came when Jacob realized how his situation was affecting Evangeline. She had been watching the consequences of his public support from her house on Elm Street, seeing how the town was turning against him because of his association with her. The knowledge that she was destroying the life of the one person who had shown her kindness was more painful than all the fear and rejection she had endured herself. On a cold November evening, Evangeline walked to Jacob's ranch to have a conversation she had been dreading for days. "You have to stop," she said without preamble when he answered his door. "You have to stop defending me, stop associating with me, stop sacrificing everything you've built here for someone who isn't worth it." Jacob stepped aside to let her into the house, but she remained on his porch, wrapped in her black cloak against the evening chill. "Come inside," he said. "We need to talk about this properly." "There's nothing to talk about," Evangeline replied. "I'm leaving Cedar Falls. I've already made arrangements to sell the house and move somewhere else where I won't cause problems for anyone." Jacob felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You're running away." "I'm accepting reality," Evangeline said firmly. "This town will never accept me, and I won't let my presence destroy your life here. You've worked too hard building your ranch and your relationships to lose everything because of me. What if I don't want to choose between you and this town?" Evangeline looked at him with eyes that held both affection and resignation. "Then you'd be making the same mistake I made when I thought I could start over in a place where nobody knew my past." "Some situations don't have happy endings, Jacob. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is walk away before things get worse." As she turned to leave, Jacob called out to her. "When?" 3 days, she replied without turning around. "I'll be gone by Sunday morning." Jacob stood on his porch watching her walk back toward town, her black figure gradually disappearing into the darkness. For the first time since meeting Evangeline Morrison, he felt truly alone. He had 3 days to decide whether he was going to let the only person who had understood his grief and loneliness disappear from his life forever, or whether he was going to fight for something that might be worth more than the approval of a town that seemed determined to choose fear over compassion. The choice would define not only his future, but the kind of man he wanted to be when faced with the decision between what was easy and what was right. Saturday morning brought news that changed everything in Cedar Falls. Dr. Murphy rode through town at dawn, stopping at every house to deliver a message that sent panic through the community like wildfire. "Diphtheria," he announced grimly to each family. "We've got diphtheria in town and it's spreading fast." The disease had started with the Cooper family, whose youngest daughter had developed the characteristic sore throat and fever on Thursday night. By Friday afternoon, 2 more children were showing symptoms. By Saturday morning, 6 children were seriously ill, and Dr. Murphy feared the number would continue to grow. Diphtheria was a parent's worst nightmare in 1885. The disease could kill healthy children within days, and it spread easily through communities, especially during the colder months when families spent more time indoors together. In larger cities, whole neighborhoods had been devastated by outbreaks that doctors seemed powerless to stop. The nearest hospital with proper isolation facilities is 3 days' ride from here, Dr. Murphy explained to the group of frightened parents who had gathered at the schoolhouse. "Even if we could transport the children safely, which we can't in their current condition, there's no guarantee the hospital could do more than we can do here." The town's single doctor was overwhelmed. He had basic medical training, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for an outbreak of this magnitude. Within hours, he was moving frantically from house to house, trying to comfort sick children and terrified parents, while knowing that his limited supplies and knowledge might not be enough to save everyone. That's when someone remembered that Evangeline Morrison had claimed to be a trained nurse. She said she worked during the war. Mrs. Peterson told her husband as they watched over their feverish son Tommy, the same boy Evangeline had saved from the creek. If that's true, she might have experience with diseases like this. Mr. Peterson, the town banker, had been one of Evangeline's harshest critics, but with his child's life hanging in the balance, his priorities shifted dramatically. "Even if she does have medical training, we don't know if we can trust her. What if she makes things worse? How could they get worse?" Mrs. Peterson asked, her voice breaking as she looked at Tommy's pale, sweating face. "He's dying, William." "Our boy is dying, and Dr. Murphy has already told us he doesn't know how to help him." Similar conversations were taking place in homes throughout Cedar Falls. Parents who had spent weeks fearing Evangeline Morrison were now faced with the possibility that she might be their children's only hope for survival. The decision to ask for her help was not made easily. A group of the town's most influential men, including Sheriff Rodriguez, Pastor Williams, and several business owners, met at the church to discuss their options. "I don't like this any more than the rest of you," admitted Mr. Henderson, whose own grandchildren were showing early symptoms of the disease. "But if that woman really has medical experience, we might not have any choice but to ask for her assistance." "And if she refuses to help?" asked Pastor Williams. "We've spent weeks treating her like a threat to our community. Why would she risk herself to save our children?" Sheriff Rodriguez had been thinking about the same question. "Maybe she won't help us. But if we don't ask and these children die, when she might have been able to save them, how will we live with ourselves?" The group fell silent as they considered the horrible irony of their situation. They had driven away the one person who might have the skills to help them, and now they had to humble themselves and beg for assistance from someone they had treated terribly. Jacob Matthews was not part of these discussions, but he heard about them when Sheriff Rodriguez rode out to his ranch that afternoon. "Jacob," the sheriff said without preamble, "we need your help." "My help with what?" "We need you to talk to Evangeline Morrison. Ask her if she help us with this diphtheria outbreak." Jacob stared at his friend in disbelief. "You want me to ask the woman you've all been calling a witch to save your children?" "We want you to ask a trained nurse to use her medical skills to help sick children," Sheriff Rodriguez replied, his voice heavy with embarrassment and desperation. "If she really has the experience she claims to have. And you're asking me because ... Because you're the only person in town she's shown any willingness to talk to," the sheriff admitted. The rest of us have spent so much time treating her like an enemy that she probably wouldn't even open her door if we knocked on it. Jacob felt a mixture of anger and satisfaction. The same people who had criticized his friendship with Evangeline were now asking him to use that relationship to save them. But his anger was tempered by the knowledge that children's lives were at stake. "I'll talk to her," he said finally. "But I can't promise she agree to help people who have treated her so badly." When Jacob arrived at Evangeline's house that evening, he found her packing the last of her belongings into wooden crates. She was scheduled to leave on the morning stagecoach, and her few possessions were carefully organized for transport. "I heard about the outbreak," Jacob said after she invited him inside. Evangeline nodded sadly. "I've been listening to the sounds from town all day. Children crying, parents calling for Dr. Murphy. It's heartbreaking. The town leaders have asked me to speak with you about helping with the sick children." Evangeline's hands stilled on the book she was wrapping. "They want my help? Dr. Murphy is overwhelmed, and the nearest hospital is too far away. If you really have medical training—" "I do have medical training," Evangeline said quietly. "I worked as a nurse for 3 years during the war, and I continued practicing afterward until my husband became ill. I've treated diphtheria before." Jacob felt a surge of hope. "Will you help them?" Evangeline was quiet for a long moment, considering a decision that would change everything. "These are the same people who accused me of cursing children and practicing witchcraft. Why would they trust me to treat their most precious possessions?" "Because they're desperate," Jacob answered honestly. "And because deep down some of them are beginning to realize they might have been wrong about you? And if I help them, and some children still die despite my efforts, what do you think will happen to me then?" Evangeline asked. "Do you think they'll thank me for trying, or will they blame me for the deaths and call it proof that I really am what they've accused me of being?" It was a fair question, and Jacob didn't have a good answer for it. Evangeline would be taking an enormous risk by involving herself in the medical crisis. If her treatment succeeded, she might finally gain acceptance in Cedar Falls, but if they failed, she could face consequences far worse than social ostracism. "I can't make this decision for you," Jacob said finally. "I can only tell you that there are children dying who might live if you help them." Evangeline walked to her front window and looked out at the town that had rejected her from the moment she arrived. In the distance, she could see lights burning in houses where families were keeping vigil over sick children. She thought about Tommy Peterson, who had looked up at her with trust and gratitude after she pulled him from the creek. She thought about all the patients she had saved during the war, and all the lives she had been unable to save despite her best efforts. "I'll need supplies," she said, turning back to Jacob. "More than Dr. Murphy probably has available. And I'll need a place to set up a proper isolation ward where I can monitor the sickest children around the clock." Jacob felt relief wash over him. The old schoolhouse could work. "It's large enough, and it's far enough from the residential areas to help prevent further spread of the disease." "And Jacob," Evangeline said, meeting his eyes with a steady gaze, "I'll need your help. This isn't something I can do alone, and I suspect most of the townspeople will still be too afraid to work closely with me." "You'll have my help," Jacob promised, "whatever you need." As they began planning their response to the crisis, neither Jacob nor Evangeline realized that the next few days would test not only their medical skills and physical endurance, but also their courage to continue helping people who had given them every reason to walk away and never look back. The makeshift hospital in the old schoolhouse operated around the clock for 2 weeks. With Evangeline working tirelessly to save the children of Cedar Falls, Jacob stayed by her side, helping to organize supplies, comfort frightened parents, and maintain the careful isolation procedures that prevented the disease from spreading further through the community. On the first day, 12 children were brought to the schoolhouse with symptoms ranging from mild fever to severe breathing difficulties. Evangeline examined each child carefully, using knowledge gained from treating similar cases during the war. She organized them by severity of illness and established treatment protocols that Dr. Murphy had never seen before but quickly recognized as effective. Where did you learn to do this? Dr. Murphy asked as he watched Evangeline skillfully insert a breathing tube to help one of the sickest children. Army field hospitals, Evangeline replied without looking up from her patient. When you're treating dozens of patients with limited supplies and no time for mistakes, you learn to be efficient and creative. The townspeople who had feared and rejected Evangeline were forced to confront their prejudices as they watched her work. She moved between the sick children with calm competence, never showing frustration or impatience even when dealing with the most difficult cases. Her gentle manner with frightened young patients and her clear explanations to worried parents revealed a side of her character that none of them had bothered to discover. Mrs. Peterson, whose son Tommy was among the patients, found herself working alongside the woman she had once crossed the street to avoid. I owe you an apology, Mrs. Peterson said quietly as they prepared medicine for the children. We all do. We judged you based on fear instead of taking the time to know who you really are. Evangeline looked up from the bottles she was organizing. People often fear what they don't understand. It's human nature. That doesn't make it right, Mrs. Peterson insisted. You had every reason to refuse to help us after the way we treated you, but you came anyway. As the days passed, more parents found themselves working in the makeshift hospital, following Evangeline's instructions and learning to provide the constant care the sick children required. They saw how she stayed awake for days at a time when children were in crisis, how she celebrated each small improvement, and how she grieved when, despite all her efforts, some patients couldn't be saved. The outbreak claimed 3 lives. Each death was devastating. But everyone who worked in the schoolhouse hospital understood that without Evangeline's intervention, the number would have been much higher. Dr. Murphy freely admitted that at least 8 children would have died. Without her expertise in around-the-clock care, she saved my daughter's life, declared Mr. Thompson, the hardware store owner who had been among Evangeline's harshest critics. Little Annie was barely breathing when we brought her in, and now she's sitting up asking for her favorite toy. I don't care what anyone says about mysterious happenings or supernatural nonsense. That woman is a healer, and this town is lucky to have her. The transformation in how people viewed Evangeline was dramatic, but not universal. A few families continued to whisper about dark forces and unnatural influences, suggesting that she had caused the outbreak in order to make herself appear heroic by ending it. But these voices were increasingly outnumbered by parents whose children had been saved and community members who had witnessed Evangeline's dedication firsthand. The turning point came on a cold December morning, when the last patient was declared fully recovered. Evangeline had not slept properly in 3 days, and Jacob could see the exhaustion in every line of her body as she completed her final examination of young Tommy Peterson. He's completely well, she announced to the boy's parents. No fever. Breathing is clear, throat looks normal, he can go home today. As word spread that the outbreak was officially over, people began gathering outside the schoolhouse. What started as a few grateful parents became a crowd of nearly half the town, including many who had never set foot in the makeshift hospital but had heard stories about what had taken place there. Pastor Williams stepped forward as an unofficial spokesman for the group. Miss Morrison, he said, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp morning air, we owe you a debt we can never fully repay. You saved our children when we had nowhere else to turn. More than that, you showed us kindness and skill despite having every reason to refuse our requests for help. Evangeline stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse, still wearing the simple work dress she had worn throughout the crisis. For the first time since arriving in Cedar Falls, she was not covered entirely in black. The change was subtle but significant, symbolizing her gradual emergence from the deepest period of her grief. I did what any person with medical training would have done, she said simply. No, interrupted Mrs. Henderson, stepping out of the crowd with tears in her eyes. You did what a truly good person would do. You put aside our failings and focused on helping those who needed it most. What happened next surprised everyone, including Evangeline herself. Mrs. Henderson walked up to her and gently lifted the black veil that still partially covered Evangeline's face. You don't need to hide behind this anymore, Mrs. Henderson said softly. We've seen who you really are." For the first time since her husband's death, Evangeline removed her mourning veil completely in front of other people. Her face was beautiful but marked by the experiences she had endured. The crowd could see the strength and compassion that had carried her through years of loss and months of rejection. In the weeks that followed, the transformation of Evangeline's place in Cedar Falls was remarkable. People who had once whispered fearfully about the woman in black now greeted her warmly on the street. Parents brought their children to her for minor medical care, trusting her skill more than the long journey to see doctors in distant towns. The old Victorian house on Elm Street became an unofficial clinic where Evangeline treated everything from broken bones to difficult births. She charged modest fees for those who could afford to pay and accepted vegetables, homemade goods, or simple gratitude from those who couldn't. Jacob continued to be her closest friend and strongest supporter, but their relationship had evolved during the crisis. Working together to save lives had shown them both that they functioned well as partners, sharing responsibilities and supporting each other through difficult decisions. On a warm day in early spring, as Evangeline worked in the garden that had once been overgrown and neglected, Jacob came to visit with something important to discuss. "I've been thinking," he said, watching her tend to the flowers that had bloomed beautifully under her care. "About what?" Evangeline asked, looking up from the roses that had replaced the wild brambles. "About the fact that you're the only person I've ever met who understands both loss and healing," Jacob said carefully. "About how much better everything in my life has become since I got to know you." Evangeline set down her gardening tools and gave him her full attention. "I'm asking if you'd consider staying in Cedar Falls permanently," Jacob continued. "Not just as the town's unofficial doctor, but as my wife, as my partner in building something good and lasting." Evangeline was quiet for a long moment, considering the proposal from a man who had stood by her when everyone else had turned away. She thought about the life she had lost and the new life she had begun to build in this small town that had taught her the difference between fear and acceptance. "Yes," she said simply, and Jacob's face lit up with a smile that rivaled the spring sunshine. Their wedding took place in Evangeline's garden on a perfect June morning, with nearly the entire town in attendance. Pastor Williams performed the ceremony under an arch of roses that Evangeline had trained to grow over a wooden frame Jacob had built. Mrs. Henderson provided the flowers for the wedding bouquet, made from the same roses that had mysteriously withered months earlier and then bloomed more beautifully than ever before. Mrs. Peterson baked the wedding cake, and even old Tom, who had been among the first to spread fearful gossip about the mysterious woman in black, offered a toast to the couple's happiness. The woman who had arrived in Cedar Falls as a figure of fear and mystery had become a beloved member of the community. The lonely rancher who had risked everything to defend her had found not only love but a true partner in all aspects of life. The wedding celebration continued into the evening, with music and dancing in the garden behind the Victorian house. Evangeline and Jacob stood together watching their neighbors and friends enjoy the festivities. The house that had once seemed dark and forbidding was now filled with light and laughter, a symbol of how completely their lives had changed. "Do you ever regret coming to Cedar Falls?" Jacob asked as they watched children playing among the flowers. Evangeline smiled, thinking of all the pain and fear and rejection that had eventually led to acceptance and love and belonging. "Never," she said, taking his hand in hers. "Sometimes the most difficult journeys lead to the most beautiful destinations." The woman in black had disappeared forever, replaced by someone who had learned that healing others could also heal yourself, and that communities willing to admit their mistakes could become stronger than those that never faced challenges at all. In Cedar Falls, fear had given way.